Christopher Columbus discovered, colonized, and conquered the continent of America in 1442. He began a centuries-long pattern of subhuman treatment towards the indigenous people of the land. 2 centuries later, in 1622, the American Indian Wars began, with English colonists fighting to have sole rights to their newly acquired land. Wars similar to this continued into the 19th century, with the War of 1812, where the U.S. fought alongside the Native Americans to defeat Britain, yet offered them no support and left them to be slaughtered by the British Army. Due to the violence used in this progress, an estimated 3,000 to 4,000 indigenous people died, something that the U.S. government and general population took as a small price to pay for their national advancement. This apathy towards Native lives continued into the 1920s, with tragedies such as the Osage Reign of Terror, which saw the Osage people of Oklahoma being murdered for their rights to profits from oil wells that was seeded on their reservation by local wealthy white businessmen who were supported by their corrupt criminal system. Economically, indigenous people have also been mistreated. The average income for indigenous people before the Great Depression was $100 a year, compared to the national average of $1,350. This discrepancy in pay, compounded with a 50% unemployment rate, demonstrates how little the U.S. government and citizens cared about the people whose lands they occupied. Before the 1930s, the indigenous people of the United States were culturally, physically, and economically isolated from the rest of the American population. Due to the work done by Native Americans in World War II and by the BIA during the Great Depression, they gained new respect from their country, were adequately compensated, and established themselves as an invaluable part of American society, yet have not been treated as such. With the stock market crash of 1929 leading to the Great Depression, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal was instituted to relieve unemployment and aid in the recovery process of the American economy. This led to the Agricultural Adjustment Act being implemented and enforced by slaughtering livestock as there was excess amounts of the product. In return for killing their product, the government promised farmers compensation via more resources or money, yet the farmers never saw any of these promises come to fruition. This extended to indigenous lands in what became known as the Navajo Livestock Reduction of the 1930s to fix the issue of soil erosion and overgrazing. What they failed to account for in this practice was that native lands were self-sufficient, meaning that they had limited economic interaction with other people, and thus their livestock and crops were their sole source of food and economic prosperity. By the 1930s, the U.S. government, through the BIA, or Bureau of Indian Affairs, had instituted a policy to reduce large Navajo sheep flocks, stating that, quote, an acre of land could only afford to carry up to 6 sheep. Native American relationships were essential to communicating their values and spiritual beliefs, as they thought that animals and all forms of life were sacred. Therefore, the mass slaughter of 148,000 goats and 50,000 sheep across multiple reservations caused great devastation for the population as their cultural values were violated and food sources became scarce. In 1933, the Indian Reorganization Act was signed into law by FDR. The act protected indigenous people's rights to their lands and their tribal sovereignty. This act signaled a turning point in the way Native Americans were treated by the government and by the BIA following the Navajo livestock reduction. In 1934, the Johnson-O'Malley Act was passed. This new act allocated substantial amounts of federal funding to be primarily used on the education of Native children. When World War II broke out, approximately 10% of the total indigenous population enrolled to fight in the war, citing that they had a powerful commitment to protect their country and their ancestral homelands from enemy invaders. Only 29 were chosen to be Navajo code talkers. The Navajo code talkers were essential to winning the war, as the Navajo spoke Dene Bezad, a language that is borderline impossible to learn or speak due to the fact that it is tonal and never written down.
Enemy machine gun nest on your right flank, destroy.
Many felt this was an opportunity to prove their patriotism, quoting that military life provided a steady job, money, status, and a taste into the white man's world. Being the minority group with the highest poverty rates, Native Americans viewed their wartime service as an economic growth opportunity, with the average income increasing to $2,500 a year. Due to their value in the war, Native Americans were also placed in all units regardless of race. When the war ended, Native Americans returned to their reservations significantly wealthier following their time served. The roles indigenous people played in the war were not recognized. Those who served were often looked at with disdain by their own families for supporting a country and government that had oppressed them. However, those who fought took great pride in their service and were proud to represent the United States. Chester Nez, for example, described his time in combat.
Everything that we did is one of the most important stories. I am glad that I have went through the battles and everything.
Since World War II has ended, indigenous people rights have become increasingly expanded in the last 3 decades through the adoption of international deals, such as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. As access to education has evolved, Native communities have been able to educate themselves and others on their history and civil liberties. Additionally, President George H.W. Bush officially decreed that November was Native American Heritage Month in the 90s. Currently, there are an estimated 476 million indigenous people worldwide. This makes up around 6% of the global population. However, they account for 19% of people in extreme poverty. And according to the World Bank, indigenous people often lack formal recognition over their lands, are often last to receive public investments, and face multiple barriers to participate fully in the economy, enjoy access to justice, and participate in political processes and decision-making. Due to this immense economic disparity, indigenous people currently have an estimated annual income of $23,000 a year, with their unemployment being well above the national average in 2022, with a rate of 11.1% compared to the national average of 3.5%. Even as the lands occupied by indigenous people are protected, the government will only recognize a fraction of that land as legally belonging to the indigenous people. Insecure land ownership laws and claims, compounded with economic and social struggles, make it borderline impossible to legally acknowledge who truly owns the land. Due to this indecisiveness, there is a movement led by indigenous people called Land Back, focused on returning occupied, unoccupied, and public land across the U.S. and Canada to the native tribes of each section. The U.S. government has consistently failed Native Americans as before and after the war, and they have continued to do so well into the 21st century. The COVID-19 pandemic impacted Native American populations harder than any other community, and they are more vulnerable to effects regarding things like climate change, outbreaks, and safety hazards due to unequal access to health care and poor quality of life with overcrowded housing, toxic water, and unnutritious food. Both the people of the U.S. and its administration have also continuously turned a blind eye to the alarmingly high number of missing and murdered indigenous women, as their primary cause of death is homicide, and indigenous women have the second highest rate of homicide in the nation. Many things have changed since the Great Depression for both the United States and indigenous people. They have regained many of their rights and have become a culturally protected group, but despite serving their country, the U.S. has done little to continuously serve them.